Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really taking aim at something huge, maybe the most fundamental assumption we have. The whole idea that morality is, well, real.
Yeah, it's a big one.
We're not here debating if specific things are right or wrong, like lying or cheating. The question is much more radical, isn't it? Does wrongness itself even exist, outside of this really complex psychological setup we've built?
Exactly. We're challenging that core belief that there are these objective, sort of eternal moral truths just floating out there in the universe, waiting for us to find them, like gravity or historical dates.
Right.
So this deep dive goes into some pretty unsettling territory, moral anti-realism. We're drawing heavily on philosophers like J.L. Mackie, his skepticism, and then Friedrich Nietzsche's really quite brutal sociological history.
Our mission, then, is to try and trace where our sense of justice actually comes from and our conscience, that inner voice. Do they really hold up against this skeptical claim that maybe they're just very sophisticated ways we rationalize things? Because if morality isn't some truth we discover, but more like a highly evolved survival tool we invented, well, what does that mean for things like human freedom or self-worth, even the idea of progress?
It shakes everything up. So to get started, we really need to nail down this core concept, moral anti-realism. What is it, precisely?
Okay.
It's the philosophical view that moral judgments, statements like torture is inherently evil, or maybe loyalty is a virtue, these statements are not truth-apt.
Not truth-apt. Okay, that's a very philosopher way of putting it. Let's unpack that.
Right. It means they literally can't be true or false, they don't have the right kind of structure, or they don't correspond to any objective reality that could make them true or false.
So unlike a non-moral statement, like if I say, Mars has 2 moons.
Exactly. That statement, Mars has 2 moons, well, its truth or falsity depends on an objective reality out there, completely independent of us humans. If we all vanished tomorrow, Mars would presumably still have 2 moons.
Makes sense.
But the anti-realist says if you state it's wrong to inflict needless suffering, there's just nothing external for that statement to match up against.
Yeah.
It's more like saying broccoli is the best vegetable.
Okay, so it's like an opinion or a preference?
Sort of, yeah. It might be expressing a preference, or maybe asserting that you belong to a particular culture with certain norms, or maybe it's even like an emotional command, don't do that. But critically, it's not describing some cosmic moral fact out there.
And this is different from just saying morality is subjective, right? Like it's wrong for me, but maybe not for you.
It goes deeper than that, yeah. Subjectivism might say your murder is wrong and my murder is wrong, are 2 different, perhaps equally valid, subjective states. Anti-realism says the statement, murder is wrong, whoever says it, isn't even the kind of thing that can be true or false in the first place.
So it's more like a tool.
A very useful linguistic tool, perhaps. One that helps societies stick together.
Okay.
A bit like deciding which side of the road to drive on. It's a vital practice for order, absolutely, but it's not based on some objective truth about right-sidedness.
And okay, I get that some people might just brush this off as, typical philosophical skepticism, maybe a bit sophomoric even.
Right.
But the fact that you have serious, respected modern thinkers like J.L. Mackie arguing for it, giving it a solid grounding, that means we have to take the challenge seriously.
We really do. Because if moral anti-realism is actually correct, the implications just ripple outwards, affecting almost everything about how we see ourselves in society. So let's start with Mackie, specifically his famous argument from relativity. Now, the starting point seems simple. Just look around. There's massive disagreement about morality across different cultures, different times in history.
Sure, that's obvious enough. But disagreement alone doesn't prove anything is unreal, right? I mean, we disagree about stuff in physics all the time. Doesn't mean physics isn't real.
Exactly. And that's the crucial distinction Mackie makes. The argument isn't just that disagreement exists. It's about the kind of disagreement and maybe what causes it.
Okay. So how is moral disagreement different from, say, scientific disagreement?
Well, think about scientific disagreements maybe about the origins of the universe or how dinosaurs lived or even historical events. Usually those disagreements stem from things like not having enough evidence, or maybe making speculative leaps from the data we do have, or needing better theories.
Right. Like we disagree about how old the Earth is, maybe, but nobody serious thinks the Earth doesn't have an objective age. We just haven't pinned it down perfectly yet. We're all aiming at the same external fact.
Precisely. But Mackie suggests moral disagreement looks different. When you compare, say, a culture that practiced human sacrifice with one that absolutely forbids even capital punishment, it doesn't really look like 2 groups trying and failing to perceive the same objective moral reality.
What does it look like then?
It looks more like they're fundamentally living in and committed to radically different ways of life. The disagreement seems to reflect their participation in these distinct social structures.
Okay. That shift in focus is key, isn't it? It moves our attention away from some supposed moral truth out there and towards the actual social behavior that seems to produce the moral belief.
Yes. And that flips the script on the direction of causality.
What do you mean by direction of causality?
Well, we tend to assume the rational part comes first. Like, we investigate how society should work, we conclude rationally that helping each other is good, and therefore we adopt a way of life based on mutual aid. The morality drives the behavior.
That sounds like the standard view.
The anti-realist, following Mackey, says it's the other way around. The social behavior, the cultural structures which are themselves shaped by, cold, impersonal forces like economics, geography, survival pressures, those come first. So people participate in a certain way of life, maybe sharing resources communally because that's what survival dictates in their environment. And then because they're already doing it, they generate the moral belief that communal sharing is good and hoarding is bad.
So the moral belief isn't the cause of the behavior. It's the story we tell ourselves after the fact. A post hoc rationalization.
That's the idea. It's the explanation generated afterwards to justify the behavior that these external forces have already pushed the group into adopting. If your society absolutely needs everyone to specialize their labor to survive, you're probably not going to develop a moral code that celebrates everyone just lounging around.
Right. You'll develop one that praises hard work, duty, contribution, regardless of whether hard work has some objective cosmic goodness.
Exactly. And if you accept this view, then even your deepest, most passionately held moral conviction, the one that makes you march in the streets to protest injustice, isn't actually the thing causing you to march.
Well, hold on. What is causing it then?
The belief itself is just the narrative layer, the justification. The actual behavior, the marching, might be caused by underlying external forces, shifts in power dynamics, economic pressures, the need to manage social conflict. We're kind of like puppets, pushed around by these impersonal drivers.
But wait a minute. Think about huge moral shifts, like, say, the abolition of slavery or the fight for civil rights. Are you saying the incredibly strong moral beliefs of the people involved were causally inert, just window dressing? If it wasn't their moral conviction, what did make them risk everything?
That is the really staggering implication, isn't it? Mankey's line of thought suggests that the moral block, it's the conviction that slavery is fundamentally wrong, is epiphenomenal.
Epiphenomenal, like a side effect.
Like the steam rising from a train engine. It's produced by the engine's operation, but it doesn't actually power the train. So the real drivers for something like abolition might have been, say, underlying economic changes making slave labor inefficient, or shifts in global power making the old system unstable. The moral belief then emerges as the powerful unifying story that justifies a change already underway for other, colder reasons.
That completely reframes how we think about human agency, about making moral choices.
It does. It makes our moral compass feel less like a reliable guide steering us, and maybe more like, a beautifully crafted weather vane. It tells you which way the social winds are blowing, but it doesn't actually create the wind.
So it raises this really deep question about self-determination, doesn't it? If the moral story we tell ourselves doesn't actually cause our actions, can knowing that ever make us free? Can we consciously pick a moral path that goes against the grain of these big sociological forces?
That's the million-dollar question. And this deep skepticism about where morals come from and whether they actually do anything, well, it sets the stage perfectly for Nietzsche. Because Nietzsche doesn't just theorize. He tries to give us the terrifying historical blueprint of how this whole moral architecture might have actually been built.
Right, Nietzsche. Especially on the genealogy of morals. He really shifts gears, doesn't he? He largely drops the abstract philosophy and instead gives us this detailed, almost anthropological account of how human society developed. It's like a natural history.
Exactly. He's offering a sociological story based on what he sees as observable naturalistic laws that govern how human societies evolve. It's less about pure reason and more about historical psychology, driven by raw survival pressures.
So where does he start this story?
He starts way back.
Yeah.
In what we might call the pre-legal order, phase 1 if you like. A time before strong central authorities, defined largely by the relationship between revenge and debt.
Revenge and debt. Okay.
In early communities, if someone wronged you, stole something, hurt your family, there wasn't really a police force or court to appeal to. The injured person or their kin wasn't just allowed to get revenge. They were often socially expected to. The classic tit for tat.
And failing to retaliate was bad.
It could seriously damage your family's honor, which wasn't just about pride. It was crucial for your standing, maybe even your survival within that group.
And the sources mention a really chilling detail about debt in this world. It wasn't just about property.
Oh, not at all. If someone couldn't repay a debt, they didn't just risk losing their goods. They might have literally pledged their own body or their wife or children or even their life as collateral.
Wow. And the creditor, the person who owed the debt, what was their compensation if the debtor defaulted?
This is where it gets really dark. The compensation wasn't just about getting back the material value. The core payback was often the right to inflict, as the sources put it, every kind of indignity and torture on the debtor.
Why? What was the point of that?
Nietzsche argues it reveals a fundamental psychological driver, the creditor's pleasure, the sheer enjoyment derived from inflicting pain, from venting their power over someone now powerless, what he calls the enjoyment of violation. This feeling itself was seen as a fair exchange for the material loss.
That sounds incredibly barbaric to us now.
It does, but Nietzsche sees it as serving a raw, primitive psychological function, balancing the books, satisfying the basic human drive for power, the will to power. But, and this is crucial, this system had a massive societal cost.
Which was?
Endless, devastating blood feuds. These cycles of revenge could spiral out of control, lasting generations, constantly destabilizing communities, sometimes tearing them apart entirely.
Okay, so that instability, that constant threat, must have created pressure for change.
Absolutely. Which leads us to phase two, the establishment of central authority, which Nietzsche equates with the birth of justice. But crucially, justice doesn't arise because people suddenly had a moral epiphany that peace is good.
It arose out of necessity.
Yes. It's primarily a struggle against those reactive feelings, the grudges, the bitterness, the constant thirst for vengeance that was crippling society. It was a practical move for survival.
So how did it happen? How did justice get established?
Active and aggressive powers, as Nietzsche calls them, think early kings, strong chieftains, rising states, they basically step in and impose order. They construct a civil structure by setting limits, establishing rules, defining boundaries.
And the key move is creating law.
Exactly. They establish the institution of law. The law does two main things. It declares what actions are now considered unjust or forbidden, and critically, it claims a monopoly on violence. Inflicting harm becomes the exclusive right of the central authority.
So if someone harms me now under this new system, I can't just go get revenge myself.
No. If you do, your act of revenge isn't just an offense against the person you attacked. It's now seen as an offense against the supreme power itself, against the law, against the king, or the state. The state becomes the only creditor allowed to collect punishment.
That's a fundamental shift in how a community operates. And the sources mention this didn't just happen in a vacuum, right? There were specific conditions that allowed this central power to rise.
Yes, that's a key detail. It wasn't just about brute force, though that was part of it. The right environment was needed. Central power needs resources to sustain itself.
Like food surpluses.
Exactly. Reliable food surpluses, the rise of wealth inequality through trade or agriculture. These things provided the means to support an enforcement arm, like soldiers or guards, who could actually overpower individual families or clans caught in feuds.
And external threats played a role too.
Often, yes. Facing a common enemy, like another tribe or a rival kingdom, often forced communities to suppress their internal squabbles and unite under a single leader for collective defense. That naturally consolidated power.
So Nietzsche sounds almost like an early theorist of cultural evolution here, describing how societies adapt, driven by these harsh realities.
You could definitely read him that way. He's outlining how societies change to manage their own destructive tendencies under pressure. But, and this is really important philosophically, he warns us not to see this as progress in the moral sense, not as progressus.
Right, not like a steady march towards some better, more enlightened state.
No. He insists this evolution is messy, often cruel, almost mechanical. He calls it a succession of more or less profound processes of subduing, plus the resistances they encounter. It's cold, it's naturalistic. Society is just reacting, adapting to survive the pressures, the need for stability, managing wealth, stopping the constant bloodshed. The outcome isn't necessarily good in a moral sense. It's just perhaps more stable, more survivable for the group.
So justice, in this view, isn't some noble ideal we discovered. It's basically a tool, a centralized system built to clamp down on our most dangerous antisocial impulses. Okay, so the state has now established external control. What happens inside us when that raw, cruel impulse, the one that used to get satisfaction through revenge or torturing debtors, gets blocked? Where does all that energy go?
Ah, now you're asking the question that leads directly to Nietzsche's concept of the bad conscience, right? The bad conscience. Nietzsche uses this idea to try and explain two related but distinct things. First, why do we look at someone who breaks the rules and feel they deserve to be punished? And second, why do we ourselves feel those raw internal things like guilt and shame?
Okay, let's take the first one, why we think others deserve punishment.
So this is aspect one, the moralistic interpretation of punishment. Nietzsche starts by saying, look, objectively speaking, punishment is just a thing societies do. It's a custom, an act, a series of procedures, but its actual purpose or meaning. He says that's incredibly fluid, uncertain, and accidental. Meaning the same act of punishment, say, imprisonment might be intended to deter others at one time, rehabilitate the offender at another, simply extract vengeance at another, or maybe just isolate someone dangerous. The reason behind the act is all over the place and changes constantly.
Okay, so the practice itself doesn't have one fixed meaning.
Right. But we, as humans looking at it, slap this heavy moralistic interpretation onto this messy, shifting reality. We see the mechanical inevitability of the penalty, you break the law, punishment must come, it's just how the system works, and we instinctively conflate that inevitability with moral aptness. We jump to the conclusion that the punishment ought to come, that the person truly deserves it on some deep moral level.
It's like we mistake the is for the ought. Because punishment does follow the crime, we assume it should follow the crime.
Exactly. You can think about it like a child growing up in a house with really strict, maybe arbitrary rules. The child quickly learns, if I break the vase, I will get punished. It becomes almost automatic, mechanical. Over time, that child might start to internalize it, blurring the line between the sheer certainty of the consequence and a feeling that they are fundamentally a bad kid who genuinely deserves the pain.
They mistake the process of the rules for some kind of objective moral truth about themselves.
Precisely. And Nietzsche argues this deep-seated need we have to impose meaning, to find moral desert, is driven by something even more fundamental. Our struggle with the sheer complexity and apparent randomness of modern life.
How so?
Think about modern society. We're often subject to these huge impersonal forces, technocratic bureaucracies, global economic fluctuations, complex political systems. These things can impact our lives dramatically, but they often feel like impersonal and nearly incomprehensible natural forces, like getting hit by a hurricane or an earthquake.
It feels random, meaningless.
Exactly. And Nietzsche believed that the core human psychological problem isn't suffering itself, but the senselessness of suffering. We can endure a lot of pain if we feel there's a reason for it, a purpose, a meaning. What drives us mad is suffering that seems utterly random, arbitrary, pointless. Humans just can't tolerate senselessness.
So we invent meaning.
We feel compelled to. We invent these elaborate interpretive frameworks, maybe traditional gods and genii, or maybe modern ideologies, political narratives, anything to abolish that terrifying senselessness. The goal of these narratives is often to provide comfort by finding coherence, or, very commonly, by finding someone to blame.
We see that all the time today, don't we? Like with complex issues, climate change, economic crises, pandemics. It's often easier to latch onto a narrative that blames a specific group, a secret cabal, a conspiracy.
Right. Conspiracy theories are a perfect modern example. They take these incredibly complex, multifaceted global problems, which might just be the chaotic result of millions of interacting factors, and they refuse to accept that chaos. Instead, they simplify it dramatically by positing a small group of powerful individuals who are intentionally causing all the suffering.
And that provides a weird kind of comfort.
It does. There's a perverse relief in feeling like you're a victim of a deliberate plot, rather than just being tossed around by impersonal, meaningless forces. At least a plot has a plotter, someone to direct your anger towards. But here's where Nietzsche sees a major problem, a deep tension.
Okay.
While the whole point of creating these narratives is supposedly to alleviate suffering by making it meaningful, some narratives, particularly, he thought, certain rigid, religious, or moralistic ones, end up achieving the opposite. They do this by holding the sufferer responsible for their own pain.
How? By saying things like, you're suffering because you sinned, or you deserve this because you're fundamentally flawed.
Precisely. The narrative, aiming to explain away the external senselessness, ends up directing the blame inward. It transforms the existential dread about the world into acute self-hatred, guilt, and shame within the individual.
So it swaps one kind of suffering for another, possibly worse kind.
That's Nietzsche's critique. He sees it as deeply counterproductive. It might offer a temporary fix, a kind of psychological painkiller like a narcotic, he says, giving a quick, comforting explanation. But by making the sufferer blame themselves, by turning criticism inwards, it ultimately creates more suffering or deepens the existing pain in the long run. The problem of senseless suffering gets solved by creating the problem of relentless, self-inflicted guilt.
Okay, so that covers why we might project deservedness onto others' punishment and invent narratives to make sense of suffering. Now, what about the second aspect of bad conscience? Where do our own feelings of guilt and shame come from? The really raw, internal stuff.
Right. This is aspect 2, explaining guilt and shame. And it ties directly back to that establishment of justice we talked about. Remember how the rise of law and central authority effectively shut down the main external outlet for what Nietzsche called the human thirst for cruelty?
Yeah, that primal enjoyment in inflicting suffering, like the creditor torturing the debtor, that got blocked.
It got blocked, or at least severely restricted. Punishment became more impersonal, procedural, less about raw vengeance. So Nietzsche asks, if that powerful fundamental drive can no longer be easily expressed outwards onto others, where does that energy go? It can't just disappear.
Does it turn inward?
That's exactly his argument. It gets forcefully channeled inwardly. The aggression, the desire to dominate, the cruelty that was once directed at external enemies or debtors now gets turned back onto the self. This results in self-inflicted suffering, played out entirely within the psychological realm.
So guilt and shame are internalized cruelty.
They are the primary manifestations of this internalized violence. The individual, who used to be wild and outwardly aggressive, is now, as Nietzsche puts it, forcibly confined to the oppressive narrowness and punctiliousness of custom. Trapped within the walls of society and law, this creature, deprived of its old outlets, turns its destructive energy upon itself. It must, in his dramatic words, lacerate, persecute, gnaw at, assault, and maltreat himself.
We become our own tormentors.
Yep. We become both tormentor and victim simultaneously. This massive, ongoing project of self-directed cruelty is what creates the inner landscape of the bad conscience. And Nietzsche gives this whole long-term process a name: self-domestication. It's a kind of mass psychic suffering that over millennia has fundamentally reshaped human nature, both mentally and perhaps even physically.
The imagery he uses is just brutal. He talks about this formerly wild creature, now tamed, being racked with homesickness for the wild, and in that state becoming the inventor of the bad conscience, turning the self into an adventure, a torture chamber, an uncertain and dangerous wilderness.
It's incredibly potent imagery. The idea is that our complex inner life, our psyche, is that wilderness, that torture chamber. It's the battleground for this ongoing internalized conflict. We maintain a civilized exterior, but inside, it's a psychological prison built from redirected aggression.
And the most devastating part of this, the truly radical conclusion he draws, it relates to the things we value most about ourselves, doesn't it? Our reason, our reflection.
Exactly. We tend to look at our most sophisticated human capacities, our ability to reason, our seriousness, our emotional control, our capacity for deep thought and reflection, and we see them as signs of our inherent superiority, what makes us better than animals.
But Nietzsche flips that completely.
He argues that these very capacities, these prerogatives and showpieces of man, are not signs of superiority at all. They are, in fact, merely the products of this violent self-domestication.
So, things like reason, seriousness, mastery over the effects, the whole somber thing called reflection, these aren't innate gifts.
According to Nietzsche, no. They aren't superior traits that naturally elevated us. They are, in a sense, side effects. They're skills we were forced to develop as a consequence of having to brutally confine and internalize our most powerful destructive instincts. We needed reason and reflection to manage the inner chaos created by turning cruelty inward.
So our ability to think rationally, to be serious philosophers even, this was all bought at the price of millennia of blood and cruelty. Is that what he's saying?
That's the core claim. We're not the proud architects of our own refined nature. We are the heirs of the conscience vivisection and self-torture of millennia. Our inner depth is the scar tissue left behind by this process.
This is just completely at odds with most of Western philosophy, isn't it? Thinkers like Plato or Kant, who celebrate reason as the highest human faculty, the thing that makes us free and moral.
It turns it entirely on its head. Nietzsche effectively demotes reason. It's no longer this noble, truth-seeking faculty. It's more like a highly developed coping mechanism, a sophisticated internal control system designed purely to manage the dangerous psychic energy that society prevented us from releasing externally.
So if our ability to reflect deeply is just a consequence of being forcibly tamed, like a caged animal pacing back and forth, it loses all its nobility. It becomes almost a symptom of our confinement, not a mark of our freedom or superiority.
Precisely. It becomes a badge of our suffering, a testament to our domestication. And, this idea does resonate in some ways with modern evolutionary thinking, things like the human self-domestication hypothesis, which notes that humans, compared to our wild ancestors, show traits common in domesticated animals, like reduced aggression and maybe different physical features.
But Nietzsche's point seems much sharper, much more focused on the internal price.
Oh, absolutely. He's not just talking about physical traits. He's providing a mechanism for how our inner life itself became so complex and often so tormented. Our capacity for deep shame, for neurotic levels of self-criticism, maybe even things like anxiety and depression from a Nietzschean perspective. These could be seen as the refined modern echoes of that ancient internalized cruelty. The very richness and intensity of our inner world might just reflect the intensity of the violence we were forced to turn upon ourselves.
Which leaves us with a deeply uncomfortable question at the end of it all. Does the sophistication we've achieved, our art, our philosophy, our complex emotional lives, does that actually justify the price paid? The millennia of self-torture, the internalized cruelty, the denial of our, perhaps, more primal nature, all required to create this conscience. Is the trade-off worth it? Especially if the whole moral framework it's built on might not even correspond to objective truth.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of challenging ground today. We started with J.L. Mackey's argument, this idea that maybe objective moral truths just don't exist.
Right. The argument from relativity suggesting our moral beliefs might just be post hoc rationalizations, stories we tell to justify behaviors that are actually driven by colder sociological forces, making the beliefs themselves kind of causally inert.
Yeah, just along for the ride. Then we followed Nietzsche's genealogy, his historical account of how justice wasn't born from moral insight, but from the raw mechanical necessity of suppressing endless cycles of bloody revenge.
And how that external suppression, that centralization of power, forced our primal thirst for cruelty to turn inward.
Leading to the creation of the bad conscience, this internal landscape of guilt and shame, and how that, in turn, drove us to impose moral meaning onto suffering, sometimes blaming ourselves and creating even more pain.
And finally, we hit that really radical conclusion that the very things we prize most about ourselves, our reason, our reflection, our seriousness, might not be signs of inherent greatness, but were actually acquired through a brutal process of self-domestication, essentially bought with blood and cruelty.
So we started by asking if objective moral truths exist out there, separate from us. Nietzsche's account suggests that, well, maybe they don't. But perhaps even more profoundly, the centuries, the millennia, spent believing that they do that whole painful process of trying to justify suffering, trying to tame ourselves. That is what actually forged the complex, reflective, maybe tormented you who's listening right now.
So the final thought to leave you with is this. What does it actually mean for your life, for the ethical choices you make every day, if you start to consider that the most cherished, sophisticated parts of your own nature might have been built on a foundation of self-inflicted violence and internalized cruelty? If the very origins of conscience are tangled up with this savage history, what does that imply when we try today to build genuinely moral systems or live ethical lives? That's your deep dive for this time.